Step into the arena of minds. On this channel, every move is a clash of strategy, every sacrifice a turning point, and every game a battle for glory. Watch two players push the limits of creativity and calculation, as we bring you the drama, suspense, and excitement of chess like never before. Francisco opens with his central pawn marching boldly forward, a fearless spear thrust that immediately signals his intention to seize early battlefield momentum. Wesley So responds with his c-pawn advancing sharply, slicing into the center with cold precision, and challenging Francisco's ambitious opening claim. Francisco brings his knight forward confidently, adding pressure to the center and preparing a swift assault that keeps Wesley guessing and alert. Wesley develops his d-pawn with disciplined strength, reinforcing his structure and preparing to meet Francisco's aggression with calculated defensive resilience. Francisco drives his d-pawn straight into combat, cracking open the center and forcing Wesley into an immediate confrontation for key space. Wesley captures the advancing pawn cleanly with his c-pawn, demonstrating icy composure as he simplifies the center and disrupts Francisco's rhythm. Francisco's knight jumps into the newly opened square with energy, reclaiming territory and tightening his strategic grip across the central lanes. Wesley activates his knight smoothly, preparing counterplay, while watching Francisco's posture twist into a shape demanding tactical vigilance and timely reactions. Francisco develops his other knight, weaving a flexible attacking net, and quietly hinting at future combinations, aimed deep into Wesley's structure. Wesley pushes his pawn forward, staking space on the flank and setting up long-term counterplay, aimed at unsettling Francisco's queenside harmony. Francisco calmly brings out his dark-squared bishop, reinforcing his center and positioning the piece for future pressure toward Wesley's kingside. Wesley answers by advancing his e-pawn, strengthening the center and constructing a resilient formation ready for later dynamic transformations. Francisco castles smoothly into safety, pulling his king from danger and connecting his rooks for future coordinated operations against Wesley's defenses. Wesley develops his bishop toward a quiet square, strengthening his position, while watching Francisco's energetic setup unfold with growing intensity. Francisco advances his light-squared bishop into position, eyeing Wesley's defenses and preparing subtle attacking motifs that simmer beneath the surface. Wesley lifts his queen toward the c-file, enhancing coordination and quietly preparing tactical resources aimed at challenging Francisco's expanding presence. Francisco pushes his f-pawn forward with fiery intent, signaling aggression and preparing to strike into Wesley's kingside with increasing pressure. Wesley develops his knight deeper into action, stepping closer to the center and sharpening tactical possibilities against Francisco's growing initiative. Francisco shifts his queen to a more active post, quietly layering threats toward Wesley's king while coordinating with his rising pawn storm. Wesley castles decisively, pulling his king into shelter and preparing to unleash counterattacks once Francisco's advancing forces overextend or reveal weaknesses. Francisco sends his queen toward the kingside, sharpening pressure and signaling that his attacks will soon crash fiercely against Wesley's defensive lines. Wesley answers by capturing Francisco's knight with calm precision, removing a key attacker, and slightly loosening the momentum that had been building. Francisco's bishop recaptures smoothly, keeping central control intact while ensuring his pieces stay active and ready for the next tactical wave. Wesley pushes his b-pawn aggressively forward, challenging the queenside structure and preparing to fracture Francisco's coordination through persistent pressure. Francisco advances his pawn to carve space, attempting to restrain Wesley's expanding flank play before it grows into something dangerously disruptive. Wesley develops his bishop onto a powerful diagonal, pointing menacingly toward Francisco's king and strengthening his overall tactical presence. Francisco activates his rook along the d-file, reinforcing central influence and preparing to contest Wesley's growing pressure across multiple fronts. Wesley mirrors the idea by lifting his other rook into the d-file, constructing double pressure and challenging Francisco's control with cold intent. Francisco retreats his king to safety, sidestepping future tactics and maintaining calm, while Wesley's pieces slowly tighten their grip. Wesley's bishop slides to a more flexible post, supporting his structure and preparing long-term counterplay that could erupt suddenly. Francisco reroutes his bishop carefully, knitting his pieces together as he prepares to meet Wesley's escalating central tension. Wesley pushes his pawn again, ripping open queenside space and putting Francisco under mounting pressure as the battlefield becomes increasingly sharp. Francisco pushes his e-pawn boldly forward, sacrificing structure to challenge Wesley's strong center and stir up tactical complications. Wesley captures the offered pawn with ruthless calm, accepting tension and daring Francisco to prove real compensation against his poised structure. Francisco activates his bishop once more, circling toward the center to keep pressure alive while Wesley's forces remain tightly coordinated. Wesley strikes by capturing the central bishop with icy precision, removing a key defender and tightening his grip over the unfolding middle game. Francisco recaptures solidly with his bishop, restoring material balance while trying to maintain active piece play against Wesley's stable center. Wesley pushes his queen into the f-file, increasing activity and preparing threats that could suddenly flare into kingside chaos. Francisco brings his queen to a central post, reinforcing key squares and attempting to steady the position before Wesley's pressure becomes overwhelming. Wesley boldly captures Francisco's knight with his queen, seizing material and dramatically shifting momentum as tension ripples through the position. Francisco's bishop recaptures in the center, trying to restore balance while desperately maintaining activity against Wesley's increasingly dominant presence across the board. Wesley shifts his bishop toward the f-file, tightening control and preparing coordinated threats that creep dangerously closer to Francisco's weakened king defenses. Francisco advances his queen toward the d-file, reinforcing his structure and attempting to reorganize before Wesley's initiative overwhelms every defensive resource. Wesley calmly activates his light-squared bishop, sliding it to a harmonious square that strengthens coordination and amplifies pressure on Francisco's strained lines. Francisco maneuvers his bishop back into position, keeping tension alive while searching for counterplay against Wesley's methodical and unforgiving buildup. Wesley pushes his knight deeper into the center, planting it firmly as a spear point that threatens to unravel Francisco's scattered defenses with frightening precision. Francisco captures Wesley's knight using his bishop, eliminating the dangerous piece, but loosening his own structure in the process as tension escalates sharply. Wesley's bishop recaptures efficiently, maintaining central domination and increasing pressure as Francisco struggles to keep pace with unfolding threats. Francisco brings his king closer to the center, aiming for stability while bracing against mounting dangers that Wesley positions with chilling accuracy. Wesley's bishop shifts toward the d-file, aligning multiple pieces and preparing tactical sequences that could pierce Francisco's fragile defense at any moment. Francisco moves his king forward again, creeping toward safety, while trying to escape potential tactical storms swirling across the board's center. Wesley advances his king confidently, stepping into the heart of battle as his superior activity begins tightening around Francisco's narrowing options. Francisco directs his bishop to the d-file, seeking counterplay and hoping to disrupt Wesley's expanding influence before the danger becomes unstoppable. Wesley pushes his pawn aggressively along the e-file, challenging Francisco's setup and preparing to carve open new lines for his coordinated forces. Francisco shifts his bishop toward the b-file, trying to maintain activity while watching Wesley's army gather strength with overwhelming momentum. Wesley marches his king forward with confidence, stepping into a dominant central role that amplifies the pressure Francisco faces in every direction. Francisco advances his king deeper into the center, attempting a defensive regroup as Wesley's coordinated threats continue closing around him relentlessly. Wesley places his king onto an even stronger square, enhancing support for his advancing pawns and creating a formidable presence Francisco struggles to oppose. Francisco moves his king further forward, clinging to hopes of resistance while Wesley's unified forces prepare decisive tactical breakthroughs. Wesley shifts his bishop toward the c-file, tightening control over critical squares and increasing the discomfort pressing against Francisco's diminishing defenses. Francisco advances his bishop along the c-file, seeking activity and hoping to slow Wesley's tightening grip as the battlefield grows increasingly unforgiving. Wesley responds by shifting his bishop onto a dominant diagonal, reinforcing pressure and preparing new threats that loom ominously over Francisco's weakened position. Francisco pushes his h-pawn forward, creating luft and attempting to stabilize while Wesley's forces continue tightening their coordinated stranglehold across the board. Wesley calmly places his bishop into a more commanding post, intensifying pressure and further restricting Francisco's already limited maneuvering possibilities. Francisco directs his queen toward the c-file, rallying his pieces and trying desperately to re-establish control before Wesley's initiative becomes irreversible. Wesley activates his bishop along the g-file, sliding into position with menacing purpose and further cornering Francisco's struggling defenders. Francisco shifts his bishop back toward the d-file, searching for counterplay, while Wesley's pieces continue to dominate every critical pathway. Wesley strikes fiercely by capturing Francisco's queen, delivering a crushing blow that sends shockwaves through the position and seizes overwhelming control. Francisco's bishop recaptures the invading queen, reclaiming material but failing to halt the unstoppable force of Wesley's perfectly coordinated attack. Wesley eliminates Francisco's central bishop with his own, tightening his advantage and pushing the position steadily toward an inevitable and decisive conclusion. Francisco advances his e-pawn forward, attempting to challenge Wesley's dominance and create counterchances amidst the increasingly bleak strategic landscape. Wesley shifts his bishop toward the d-file, strengthening central influence and preparing to dismantle the last remnants of Francisco's defenses. Francisco brings his bishop to a central post, reinforcing his structure and searching for any remaining opportunities to complicate Wesley's firm advantage. Wesley steps his king into an even more active square, heightening coordination and preparing to escort advancing pawns toward victory. Francisco moves his bishop deeper into enemy territory, trying to create tension and spark complications, despite Wesley's overwhelming positional superiority. Wesley pushes his c-pawn confidently forward, breaking lines open and forcing Francisco to confront new threats that surge relentlessly across the board. Francisco draws his bishop back towards safety, recognizing the looming danger and attempting to reorganize before Wesley's attack becomes unstoppable. Wesley advances his h-pawn powerfully, preparing to open additional lanes and drive home his attack with crushing clarity and precision. Francisco shifts his bishop toward the h-file, clinging to defensive resources while Wesley's forces continue tightening the noose around his exposed position. Wesley drives his g-pawn forward aggressively, tearing into Francisco's kingside structure and unleashing waves of pressure that threaten a decisive breakthrough. Francisco moves his bishop closer to the center, attempting to maintain influence while Wesley's coordinated forces steadily constrict his available options. Wesley pushes his f-pawn forward, aggressively threatening Francisco's bishop and opening lines that escalate the attack toward the exposed king. Francisco boldly places his bishop deep into enemy territory, looking to provoke complications and slow Wesley's crushing momentum across the board. Wesley jumps his knight into a commanding post, targeting the advanced bishop and increasing tactical pressure while keeping his attack relentless. Francisco captures the knight with his bishop, trying to simplify the position and reduce immediate threats, but the overall pressure remains suffocating. Wesley recaptures with his bishop, maintaining control over key squares and preserving a powerful centralized presence to dominate the battlefield. Francisco moves his king toward the back rank, seeking shelter while coordinating with remaining pieces to resist Wesley's increasingly powerful position. Wesley shifts his bishop toward a dominant diagonal, tightening control and threatening decisive tactical blows that force Francisco into passive defense. Francisco retreats his king slightly, avoiding immediate danger while attempting to hold the remaining lines against Wesley's coordinated assault. Wesley pushes his e-pawn forward, breaking open the center and increasing pressure that further limits Francisco's already cramped defensive possibilities. Francisco interposes his bishop to block, attempting to slow Wesley's advance while keeping the last defensive resources aligned for a counter. Wesley advances his pawn with sharp intent, checking Francisco's king and creating unstoppable tactical threats that edge the game toward conclusion. Francisco steps his king aside, carefully evading immediate threats while trying to maintain hope amidst the growing tactical storm around him. Wesley centralizes his king aggressively, joining the assault and ensuring all advancing pawns and pieces work in deadly harmony. Francisco marches his king forward into the center, aiming to stay connected with remaining pieces, while Wesley's forces tighten their iron grip. Wesley shifts his bishop with a checking threat, slicing through Francisco's defensive lines and forcing precise responses to avoid catastrophic loss. Francisco steps his king to safety, keeping the monarch connected while preparing his few remaining pieces to resist Wesley's overwhelming pressure. Wesley drives his e-pawn forward decisively, advancing a key asset that dominates central squares and limits Francisco's already fragile options. Francisco interposes his bishop, attempting to block and trade, hoping to relieve some pressure and create fleeting counterchances in a desperate position. Wesley urges his e-pawn with check, opening decisive lines and forcing Francisco's king into constrained positions that foreshadow imminent defeat. Francisco moves his king cautiously, stepping away from the check while attempting to coordinate remaining pieces for a last desperate defensive effort. Wesley centralizes his king aggressively, marching into the center to support advancing pawns and coordinate a decisive, unstoppable final attack. Francisco advances his bishop toward the queen's side, hoping to create counterplay and trade pieces to relieve pressure, though options are rapidly diminishing. Wesley boldly marches his king forward, penetrating deep into enemy territory and turning his monarch into a powerful, decisive weapon in the endgame. Francisco retreats his bishop toward defensive squares, attempting to block Wesley's advancing forces while stalling for precious time in a critical moment. Wesley continues advancing his king, invading further into Francisco's position and threatening critical pawns while maintaining relentless pressure across the board. Francisco repositions his bishop to a back-rank file, desperately seeking defensive shelter while trying to create last-ditch complications to slow Wesley's march. Wesley pushes his h-pawn forward, creating luft and reinforcing his attacking formation, while restricting Francisco's remaining pieces from finding safe squares. Francisco repositions his bishop along the h-file, clinging to fragile defensive squares, while Wesley's overwhelming forces tighten the grip inexorably. Wesley thrusts his g-pawn forward with deadly precision, opening lines and breaking Francisco's last defenses while increasing pressure toward final victory. Francisco captures the advancing pawn with his bishop, trying to delay the inevitable while Wesley's forces continue advancing relentlessly toward checkmate. Wesley drives his e-pawn forward, breaking through completely and securing a decisive victory as Francisco's remaining defenses collapse under relentless pressure. That's the end of today's video. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really motivates me to bring you even more exciting chess games. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.